The first time I felt the floor shake beneath my boots, I was already pinned against a wall by a creature 3 times my height, and I had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether I was going to die on a trade station I had only just arrived on. My name is Daniel Hart, and I was not supposed to be important. That was the whole point. I was the smallest delegate on the Verlanus trade station, a place built by no single species but used by all of them, a floating market and meeting ground hanging in the gap between 3 rival star systems. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 6 years. We were new, we were untested, and to almost everyone walking those silver corridors, we were small, soft, and laughably easy to underestimate. The Kragnar envoy who had me against the wall was named Drev. He stood close to 4 meters tall, with plated gray skin that looked like volcanic rock and arms built for breaking things. He had not liked the way I negotiated a shipping contract an hour earlier. He had not liked that I refused to raise my voice, refused to back down, and refused to give his trading house a better deal just because he loomed over the table like a mountain deciding whether to fall on someone. So now, in an empty maintenance corridor with no cameras and no witnesses, he had decided to teach the small human a lesson. "You people," Drev said, his voice a deep grinding rumble, "send your weakest to speak for you. It is an insult, a joke." I did not answer right away. My back was against cold metal. His forearm pressed under my collarbone hard enough that breathing took effort. I could have tried to fight. I could have tried to talk my way out the way I usually did. Instead, I did something simpler. I reached down to the small transmitter clipped to my belt, the one I always carried, the one nobody on this station had bothered to ask about, and I pressed it twice. 2 short pulses, a signal that meant only one thing: come. Drev did not notice. He was too busy enjoying himself, listing all the reasons humans were a pathetic addition to galactic trade, all the reasons our soft skin and our weak claws, and our lack of any natural weapon made us a species that did not deserve a seat at the table. I let him talk. I always let people talk when they were about to learn something. 3 seconds later, the corridor began to hum. It started low, beneath hearing, a vibration that traveled up through the floor plates and into my boots before it ever became a sound. Drev felt it too. His grip loosened slightly, his head turning toward the far end of the corridor, where a heavy cargo hatch sealed off the maintenance shaft that connected to the station's lower bay. Then came the sound. Not a roar. Not yet. Just breathing. Slow and enormous. The kind of breathing that belonged to something far too large to be moving through a corridor built for cargo crates and maintenance drones. The hatch buckled inward. Drev released me so fast I nearly fell. He took 2 steps back, his rocky skin losing some of its confident gray sheen, paling toward something closer to ash. I straightened my jacket, rubbed my collarbone, and turned to face the hatch with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing exactly what is about to walk through it. The metal groaned, then tore, peeling back like the foil lid on a ration pack, and through the gap stepped a creature that made even the corridor lights seem to dim, as if the air itself was making room for her. She was easily 4 meters at the shoulder, her body covered in deep charcoal scales that shifted faintly blue under the station lighting. 6 limbs moved her forward with a silence that should not have been possible for something her size, each footstep landing with controlled, deliberate weight, like she was choosing not to break the floor, rather than being unable to. Her head was long and angular, lined with ridges that ran back into a crest, and when she opened her mouth slightly, rows of teeth caught the light like polished obsidian. Her eyes, pale gold and slitted, fixed on Drev with an attention that made the air feel thinner. I reached out and rested my hand against the side of her jaw. She leaned into the touch immediately, the low rumble in her chest softening from threat to something closer to a deep, contented growl. "This is Cinder," I said, my voice calm, almost friendly. "She does not like it when people put their hands on me." Drev did not speak. Drev did not seem capable of speaking. His eyes were locked on Cinder the way prey locks onto a predator it has already lost the chance to outrun. I had seen this reaction before, on other worlds, in other rooms. It never got old, watching the precise moment when someone's idea of how the galaxy was organized fell apart in front of them. "You said humans send their weakest to speak for them," I continued, stepping forward, my hand still resting against Cinder's jaw as she matched my pace, her massive frame moving around me like a wall that had decided to walk. I want you to think about that sentence again. Think about what kind of species would consider this. I gestured to myself. A safe choice to send into a room full of strangers. Drev's back hit the corridor wall. There was nowhere else for him to go. She is a pet, I said simply. Not a weapon, not a soldier. A pet. The kind of animal a human keeps in their home. The kind that sleeps at the foot of a bed. The kind that children are allowed to play with. I paused, letting that sink in. Ask yourself what we keep for actual protection. I did not wait for an answer. I patted Cinder's jaw once, turned, and walked back down the corridor the way I had come, her enormous frame falling into step a half-pace behind me, her breathing slow and even, the predator already calm again now that the moment of danger had passed. Behind us I heard Drev slide down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his armored plates scraping against metal, his breathing ragged in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. I did not feel proud of that moment. Not exactly. I felt something closer to relief, the kind that comes from confirming a plan still works exactly the way it is supposed to. Humanity had learned a long time ago that the galaxy judged you by what you appeared to be capable of, not by what you actually were. Every species we had met measured threat in size, in claws, in armor plating and raw physical strength. None of them had thought to ask what it meant that the smallest, softest species in known space had also produced explorers willing to walk into the most dangerous places in the galaxy and come back with something the rest of the galaxy had spent generations learning to fear and avoid. We reached the main concourse a few minutes later, and the noise of the station rolled over us, a constant background hum of dozens of species haggling, arguing, laughing, and trading in 100 different languages, translated through the small devices clipped to every set of ears, antennae, or whatever else passed for hearing among the crowd. Most of them did not notice me. Most of them noticed Cinder. A pair of Voth traders, tall insectoid figures with chitinous blue exoskeletons and multiple jointed limbs, froze mid-conversation as we passed. Their antennae swept toward Cinder, picking up vibrations, scent, whatever it was their species used to read danger. One of them took an involuntary step backward into a market stall, knocking over a display of small luminous crystals that scattered across the floor in a wave of blue light. Neither of them moved to pick them up. They were too busy watching the massive creature walking calmly beside a human, less than half her height, her crest low and relaxed, her golden eyes drifting lazily across the crowd, the way a house cat might watch birds outside a window, mildly interested, but in no hurry to act. I had been warned, before I left Earth, that this assignment would be difficult. The Verlanus trade station hosted negotiations between species who had spent centuries building reputations on strength and dominance, and humanity, 6 years into galactic contact, had neither the fleet size nor the raw physical presence to compete on those terms. Our diplomats had been laughed out of rooms before. Our trade offers had been dismissed without serious consideration, not because the offers were bad, but because nobody believed a species that looked like us could have anything worth taking seriously. So when the offer came to bring a companion animal to the summit, buried deep in a list of standard diplomatic accommodations meant for emotional support animals and small domesticated creatures, I had submitted the paperwork myself. Service companion, non-threatening domesticated fauna. The form had a weight limit field that I left blank, because the form had never been designed with anything like Cinder in mind, and nobody on the approval committee had thought to ask why a human delegate needed a companion animal classification with no listed maximum size. They had not read carefully. They never did. That was the advantage of being underestimated. Nobody checks the details on something they have already decided does not matter. We reached the private quarters assigned to the human delegation, a modest set of rooms near the edge of the station that the assignment committee had clearly chosen because they assumed humans required little space and even less consideration. Grace Bennett was waiting just inside the door, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between amused and exasperated. "You let her out of the cargo hold again," Grace said, not quite a question. "Drev needed a lesson," I replied, stepping past her into the room, while Cinder folded herself down near the far wall with a soft, heavy sigh, her long tail curling around her body, taking up most of the available floor space without seeming to care that the room had not been built for something her size. Grace was the only other human on the negotiating team, a logistics specialist with sharp eyes, and a sharper memory for every trade clause that other species tried to slip past us in fine print. She had been with me since the early planning stages of this assignment, back when the idea of bringing Cinder to a galactic trade summit had still felt like either brilliance or madness, depending on the hour of the day you asked. "You know they're going to ask questions eventually," Grace said, crossing the room to crouch near Cinder, scratching gently along the base of her crest. The great predator's eyes slid half shut, a low rumble of contentment vibrating through the floor. Real questions, not just staring and whispering. "I'm counting on it," I said. Grace looked up at me, her expression sharpening slightly. "You want them to ask." I sat down on the edge of a low bench, watching Cinder's tail flick lazily across the floor, scattering a thin layer of dust that had settled there since the room was last cleaned. "Every species here measures us by what we look like. Soft skin, no claws, no natural armor, no obvious strength. They've spent 6 years deciding we're harmless because we don't look dangerous." I nodded toward Cinder. "I want them to ask how a species that looks like us ended up with something like her sleeping in our quarters like she belongs there. I want them to sit with that question for a while before they get an answer." Grace was quiet for a moment, studying Cinder's enormous, relaxed form, the kind of stillness that only comes from absolute trust between two creatures who have known each other a long time. "And when they do ask," she said finally, "what exactly are you planning to tell them?" I thought about the answer for a moment, turning it over the way I had turned it over 100 times before, ever since this assignment had begun. The truth was complicated. The truth involved a war zone, an orphaned creature, and choices that humanity had made when no one else was watching. Choices that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the simple, stubborn refusal to leave something helpless behind. But the truth was also, in its own way, the most powerful weapon I had brought onto this station. More powerful than any trade contract or diplomatic argument. "The truth," I said. "Just not all of it. Not yet." Outside our quarters, the station carried on with its endless noise of commerce and negotiation, unaware that the smallest, quietest delegation in the building had just changed the terms of every conversation that was about to happen. Cinder shifted in her sleep, one massive eye cracking open to check on me before closing again, satisfied that everything in her small world remained exactly where it was supposed to be. I leaned back against the wall and allowed myself a small, private smile. The galaxy had spent 6 years deciding what humans were. Tonight, at the welcome banquet, they were going to find out they had been wrong the entire time. The banquet hall on Verlana Station had been built to impress every species that walked through its doors, with ceilings high enough to accommodate the tallest Kragnar dignitaries, and lighting tuned to frequencies that pleased a dozen different kinds of eyes. Long tables curved in concentric rings around a central floor reserved for formal greetings, and above it all hung a slow rotating display of star charts, showing every system currently participating in the trade summit. It was meant to be neutral ground. It was meant to remind everyone present that they were equals here, regardless of size or strength. Nobody in that room actually believed it, including me. I arrived later than most of the other delegations, partly by design, and partly because getting Cinder through the narrow service corridors without drawing early attention required patience that the main entrance did not allow for. Grace walked beside me in a dark formal jacket, her expression composed into the kind of careful neutrality that diplomats learn to wear like armor. Behind us, Cinder moved with the same quiet, controlled pace she always carried. A leash looped loosely around my wrist, more out of formality than necessity, since nothing about her posture suggested she needed restraining. The protocol for the evening had been clear in the briefing packet sent to every delegation 3 days earlier. All companion animals, service creatures, and bonded fauna were to be presented formally during the welcome ceremony, walked once around the central floor, so the gathered delegates could observe them before the actual negotiations began. It was a tradition borrowed from the Cetran diplomatic code, originally meant to demonstrate that a delegation had nothing dangerous hidden among its support staff. Most species used the moment to show off small decorative creatures, bred for elegance rather than function. Brightly feathered things from Kragnar home gardens. Delicate floating spore creatures kept by the Voth for ceremonial purposes. Nothing that required more than a polite glance and a few words of admiration before the evening moved on to actual business. I had read that briefing packet very carefully. I had also read, with great interest, that the protocol made no mention of size restrictions, because no delegation in the station's recorded history had ever needed one. The lead Cetran diplomat for the evening was a woman named Lyra Voss, tall and silver-skinned in the way of her people, with eyes that shifted color slightly depending on the angle of the light, a trait the Cetrans considered a mark of honesty, since it made deception through expression nearly impossible among their own kind. She stood at the center of the floor, addressing each delegation as they entered, her voice carrying easily across the vast hall, through some combination of natural projection and subtle technological assistance built into the room itself. "Delegation of Earth," she announced as we crossed the threshold, her tone polite, but carrying just enough weight to suggest that even she was curious how this particular moment would unfold. Word of the incident in the maintenance corridor had clearly already reached her, even if the official report had been quietly buried by Drev's own delegation, too embarrassed to admit what had actually happened. I stepped forward, Grace a half-pace behind me, and Cinder following at the end of her leash with the unhurried confidence of a creature who had never once needed to hurry for anything in her life. The murmur that had filled the hall a moment earlier dropped away almost instantly, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear the soft clicking of Voth mandibles shifting in surprise, somewhere off to my left. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, the color shifting from their usual pale silver toward something closer to amber, a reaction her people could not fully control even when they wanted to. She had clearly expected something small, a bonded service creature perhaps, a trained companion animal sized for human convenience. What walked through those doors instead stood taller than most of the Kragnar in the room, her scaled body moving with a fluid, deliberate grace that made every other creature presented that evening look like a child's toy by comparison. "This," Lyra said carefully, her composure returning faster than I had expected, though her eyes had not fully settled back to their neutral color, "is your companion animal, Commander Hart." "Her name is Cinder," I said, keeping my voice light, almost casual, as if there was nothing unusual about the situation at all. "She has been with my family for most of her life. She does not enjoy large crowds, so I appreciate everyone keeping a respectful distance during the introduction." The phrase "respectful distance" did exactly what I wanted it to do. Nobody in that hall needed it explained to them why distance might be a wise choice. Cinder's presence alone communicated everything that needed communicating, far more effectively than any speech I could have given. I led her in the slow circuit around the central floor that protocol demanded, past tables of Kragnar envoys whose armored plating seemed to stiffen visibly as we passed, past clusters of Voth traders whose antennae swept toward us in long, searching arcs, past delegations from systems I had only ever seen labeled on star charts, their representatives leaning back in their seats, as Cinder's shadow fell across their tables. She did not growl, she did not show her teeth, she simply walked, calm and contained, radiating the unmistakable presence of something that did not need to threaten anyone, because everyone in the room already understood exactly what she was capable of. A young Kragnar seated near the edge of the floor, smaller than the others around him, clearly still new to formal diplomatic settings, reached out as we passed, perhaps out of simple curiosity, perhaps wanting to prove to his table that he was not afraid. His hand had barely cleared the edge of his seat when Cinder's head turned toward him, slow and deliberate, her pale golden eyes locking onto his, with an intensity that made him freeze mid-motion, his arm suspended in the air, as if the muscles controlling it had simply forgotten how to move. I did not pull on the leash. I did not need to. Cinder held the young envoy's gaze for perhaps 3 full seconds, long enough for every creature at that table to fully absorb the moment, before she simply looked away again and continued walking, utterly unbothered, as if the interruption had not been worth the energy of a true reaction. The young Kragnar's hand dropped back into his lap so fast it knocked over a glass of dark liquid, which spread slowly across the table, while nobody at his side moved to clean it up, too distracted by what they had just witnessed to care about spilled refreshments. We completed the circuit and returned to the center of the floor, where Lyra Voss was waiting with an expression I recognized immediately, the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to ask the question burning in their mind in front of an audience this large. "On behalf of the summit organizers," she said, her voice steady, despite the faint tremor of color still moving through her eyes, "I welcome the delegation of Earth, and Commander Hart's companion, to the Verlanus Trade Summit." The applause that followed was thinner than the applause given to other delegations earlier that evening, not from disrespect, I realized, but from a room full of beings who were not entirely certain they wanted to draw any more attention to themselves than necessary. I bowed slightly, the traditional human gesture of acknowledgement that most species had learned to recognize over the past 6 years, and led Cinder toward the table reserved for our delegation along the outer ring of the hall. Grace waited until we were seated, and the formal portion of the evening had shifted back into general conversation, before she leaned close, her voice low enough that only I could hear it, over the rising noise of the hall. "You could feel that, right?" she said, the whole room recalculating. "I could feel it," I said, watching Cinder settle onto the floor beside our table, her massive head resting on her front limbs, eyes half closed, but never fully shut, the posture of a creature who rested, but never truly slept, while surrounded by strangers. That was the point. Across the hall, I noticed Lyra Voss had not returned to her own delegation's table immediately. She stood near the edge of the central floor, speaking quietly with 2 other Cetran officials, their heads bent together, in the particular posture that diplomats everywhere seem to share when discussing something they did not want overheard. Every few seconds, one of them glanced in our direction, quickly looking away again when they realized I had noticed. I let them talk. I let the whispers spread, table by table, delegation by delegation, the way rumors always spread fastest in rooms full of professional gossips pretending to discuss trade tariffs. By the time the main course was served, I could see the pattern repeating itself across the hall in dozens of small variations, a Voth trader leaning close to a colleague's antennae to murmur something, a Kragnar envoy glancing nervously toward our table before quickly returning attention to his plate, a cluster of smaller delegations from systems I did not recognize huddled together, clearly trading theories about what exactly a human considered a domesticated pet. Grace ate slowly, watching the room with the same quiet attentiveness she brought to every negotiation, cataloging reactions the way she cataloged contract clauses. "They're going to ask," she said again, echoing what she had told me back in our quarters. "Someone's going to walk over here before the night is done." "Let them," I said. "That's the only way this works. We can't tell them what we are. We have to let them ask, and then we let the answer land exactly the way it's supposed to." It did not take as long as I expected. Roughly an hour into the banquet, as the formal courses gave way to a more relaxed period of mingling between delegations, a figure approached our table that I had not anticipated, though in hindsight, I probably should have. It was not Lyra Voss, not yet, though she watched from across the hall with obvious interest. It was an older Voth trader, his blue exoskeleton dulled with age, his movements slower and more deliberate than the younger members of his species, the kind of presence that came from decades spent surviving in a galaxy that did not forgive carelessness. He stopped a respectful distance from our table, his multiple eyes flicking between me and Cinder, with an expression I had learned to associate with genuine curiosity rather than fear. "Commander Hart," he said, his translated voice carrying a slight clicking undertone from his natural speech patterns. "I am Trade Director Kessin, of the Western Hive Consortium. I hope you will forgive the intrusion." "Not an intrusion at all," I said, gesturing to the empty seat beside Grace. "Please." He settled into the chair with careful precision, his multiple limbs folding in ways that human furniture clearly had not been designed to accommodate, though he managed it without complaint. His attention drifted again toward Cinder, who lifted her head slightly at the new presence, studied him for a moment with mild interest, and then settled back down, apparently deciding he posed no concern worth further attention. "I have traded across 11 systems in my lifetime," Kessin said slowly, his eyes still fixed on Cinder. "I have seen creatures bred for war, creatures bred for labor, creatures kept as symbols of wealth and status, by houses far older than your species' presence among the stars. I have never, in all those years, seen anything quite like this. She's not bred for anything," I said honestly. "She wasn't created in a lab, or selected through generations of careful breeding for a specific purpose. She's just Cinder. She happens to be very large and very capable, and she happens to be mine." Kessin's antennae shifted in a pattern I did not fully understand, though Grace, who had spent more time studying Voth body language during her preparation for this assignment, leaned in slightly, with interest of her own. "May I ask," Kessin said carefully, where a species so recently arrived among the stars acquired such a creature. My own people spent generations developing breeding programs simply to produce companion fauna, a fraction of her size. I find myself struggling to imagine the circumstances that led to this. It was the question I had been waiting for all evening, the one I had known would come eventually from someone curious enough, or brave enough, to actually ask it directly, rather than simply whispering theories across the hall. I considered my answer carefully, the way I had been considering it for hours, choosing exactly how much truth to offer this particular moment, this particular audience. "It's a long story," I said finally, allowing a small, knowing smile to settle across my face. "And not one I think this banquet hall is quite ready to hear all at once." Kessin studied me for a long moment, his ancient eyes calculating something I could not quite read, before he finally inclined his head, in what I had learned was a Voth gesture of patient acceptance. "Then I look forward," he said, "to hearing it eventually." He rose from his seat, bowed slightly toward Cinder, in a gesture that seemed almost reverent, and made his way back across the hall to his own delegation's table, where I could see him immediately bending close to share whatever he had learned with the traders seated around him. Grace watched him go, then turned back to me, with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and concern. "You're enjoying this," she said. "I am," I admitted. "It's the first time since we arrived among the stars that I've watched a room full of strangers actually stop and think before they decided what humanity was worth." Across the hall, the whispers continued to spread, table by table, the questions multiplying faster than any answer I had given could satisfy. I could see it building in real time, the slow, inevitable shift from dismissal to genuine curiosity, from curiosity toward something that bordered, in some of those careful, watching eyes, on caution. It would not stay contained to whispers for long. I knew that. By tomorrow, every delegation on this station would know about Cinder, and every delegation would be asking the same question that Kessin had asked tonight, the question I had been preparing an answer for, since long before I ever boarded the transport that brought me here. What kind of species raises something like this, and calls it a pet? I looked down at Cinder, resting peacefully beside our table, despite the hundreds of curious, wary eyes, still tracking her every breath across the hall, and I felt the quiet certainty that the answer to that question was about to change everything humanity's neighbors believed about us. The trouble started 2 days later, in the middle of the formal trade negotiations, when a delegation nobody had paid much attention to during the banquet decided that whispers and curiosity were not enough. They wanted proof. The negotiation chamber sat one level below the banquet hall, a smaller, more functional space designed for the actual business of the summit rather than its ceremony. Long tables faced each other in rows, translation devices humming quietly along their edges, and every delegation had been assigned a fixed seating position determined by some ancient protocol that none of the newer species fully understood, but all of them respected out of habit. Cinder was not permitted inside the negotiation chamber itself, a rule I had expected and quietly agreed to without complaint, since her presence there would have served no purpose beyond intimidation, and intimidation was not what I needed during the actual business of trade discussions. She remained instead in a holding area just outside the chamber doors, watched over by Grace, who had drawn the assignment of staying with her, while I sat through hours of dense negotiation over shipping rights and resource quotas. It was during a break in those negotiations, while delegates stretched their limbs and refreshed translation devices and traded quiet conversation in the corridor outside the chamber, that I first noticed the Kragnar military attaché watching me with an intensity that had nothing to do with trade tariffs. His name, I would later learn, was Tarn Oskev, a senior officer attached to the Kragnar delegation in an advisory capacity, though everyone in the corridor seemed to understand without being told that his real purpose at the summit had little to do with advice. He was older than Drev, more controlled, his armored plating darker and more weathered, the kind of presence that suggested decades of actual combat experience rather than ceremonial posturing. He approached me directly during the break, his footsteps heavy and deliberate against the corridor floor, and stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his eyes. "Commander Hart," he said, his voice carrying none of the polite uncertainty that had characterized most of the conversations I'd had since the banquet. I have heard a great deal about your companion these past 2 days. Most of it true, I imagine, I said evenly. I do not believe most of it, Tarn said flatly. I believe your delegation has staged an elaborate display to manipulate the perceptions of this summit. A trained creature, perhaps drugged or conditioned to appear calm in controlled settings. I have seen such tricks before, from species desperate to appear stronger than they are. I felt the corridor around us grow quieter, the way conversations always seemed to pause when something interesting was about to happen. Delegates from half a dozen species suddenly very interested in their own translation devices, while clearly listening to every word. You're welcome to your theories, I said calmly. I'm not particularly interested in convincing you otherwise. Then perhaps, Tarn said, you will not object to a demonstration. A controlled one, of course, in the presence of summit security, simply to confirm that your creature poses no genuine threat to anyone here. If she is as docile as you claim, this should present no difficulty at all. It was, I recognized immediately, a calculated trap. There was no version of this demonstration that benefited me. If Cinder remained perfectly calm under whatever provocation Tarn had planned, it would only confirm his theory that she had been drugged or conditioned into artificial passivity, undermining everything I had spent the past 2 days carefully building. And if she reacted at all, even in simple self-defense, it would hand him exactly the evidence he needed to declare humanity's companion a genuine threat to summit security. A declaration that could end this trade mission before it had truly begun. I was still considering how to respond when the decision was taken out of my hands entirely. A commotion broke out near the holding area where Grace had been keeping watch over Cinder, a sharp burst of raised voices and the clatter of overturned equipment that carried clearly down the corridor even through the general noise of the break. I did not wait for Tarn to finish whatever he had been about to say. I pushed past him, moving faster than diplomatic decorum strictly allowed, with several other delegates close behind me, drawn by the same instinct toward chaos that pulls crowds toward any sudden disturbance. What I found in the holding area made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with simple, immediate fear. 2 figures in unmarked security uniforms, the kind that summit organizers used for general station maintenance and crowd control rather than actual peacekeeping, stood near a portable containment unit that had clearly been wheeled in during the break, its surface lined with restraint fields designed for transporting dangerous cargo. Grace stood between them and Cinder, her arms spread, her voice raised in a tone I had never heard from her before, somewhere between fury and genuine panic. This was never authorized, she was saying, her words clipped and fast. Nobody cleared a containment transfer. You do not have authorization to move her. One of the security figures held up a data slate displaying what appeared to be official summit documentation, though something about the formatting looked subtly wrong to my eye. The kind of detail that would only register to someone who had spent the last several days reading nothing but official Verlanus station paperwork. Standard procedure, the figure said, his translated voice flat and mechanical. All companion fauna above a certain mass threshold require secondary security screening. This was outlined in the updated summit protocols, distributed this morning. I never received any updated protocols, Grace snapped. Cinder had risen to her full height during the commotion, her crest raised, a low warning rumble building in her chest that I felt through the floor before I consciously registered hearing it. Her golden eyes tracked between the 2 security figures with the focused intensity of a predator who understood, perhaps better than any of the panicked humans or watching delegates in that corridor, exactly what was actually happening. This was not a security screening. This was an attempt to remove her, quietly, during the chaos of a negotiation break, using forged documentation and unmarked personnel, almost certainly orchestrated by someone who wanted to either neutralize the advantage she had given humanity's delegation, or worse, capture a specimen of whatever species she belonged to, for purposes I did not want to imagine. I stepped forward, placing myself directly between Cinder and the containment unit, my heart hammering against my ribs despite the calm I forced into my voice. Show me your authorization codes, I said, directly from the Summit Security Office. Not a data slate. A verified transmission, right now, or you turn that unit around and leave this area immediately. The 2 figures exchanged a glance that lasted perhaps half a second too long, the kind of hesitation that confirmed everything Grace and I already suspected. The one holding the data slate took a step backward, his free hand drifting toward something concealed beneath his uniform jacket. And that was the precise moment everything in the corridor changed. Cinder moved. She did not lunge. She did not need to. She simply stepped forward, placing her massive body directly between the security figures and the narrow corridor exit they had clearly planned to use, her crest fully raised now, her low rumble deepening into something that vibrated through the floor plates and rattled the loose equipment still scattered from the earlier commotion. The watching crowd of delegates, who had gathered close enough to witness the confrontation, scattered backward in a wave, Voth antennae flattening, Kragnar plating bristling, even the usually composed Cetran observers retreating several full steps. The figure with the data slate froze, his hand still half raised toward whatever weapon he had been reaching for, his eyes locked on Cinder with the particular stillness of someone who had just realized, far too late, exactly how badly they had miscalculated this entire operation. "Lower your hand," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent corridor, very slowly, and step away from the containment unit. For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Cinder's rumble continued, low and steady, a sound that seemed to fill the entire corridor, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. Then the figure lowered his hand, slow and careful, and stepped back from the containment unit exactly as instructed, his companion already retreating several paces behind him. That was when Summit Security, the actual security, finally arrived, drawn by the commotion and the cluster of frightened delegates who had fled the area, their officers moving in quickly to surround the two unmarked figures before they could attempt to leave. Lyra Voss arrived only moments later, her silver skin flushed with a color I had not seen on her before, something closer to alarm than her usual careful diplomatic neutrality. "What happened here?" she demanded, her eyes sweeping across the scene, the overturned equipment, the forged containment unit, Cinder still standing protectively in front of me, with her crest raised and her low rumble only now beginning to settle. "An unauthorized attempt to remove my companion from this station," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. "Using forged documentation by personnel who are not, I would guess, actually employed by Verlanus Station Security." Lyra's eyes narrowed as she studied the two detained figures, now standing under guard, while actual security officers reviewed their data slate and uniform credentials. Her expression shifted slowly from alarm toward something colder, more focused, the look of someone beginning to understand exactly how serious this situation had actually become. "This is a violation of Summit neutrality," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the corridor. "An attempted seizure during negotiations, disguised as procedure." She turned back to me, her eyes settling on Cinder, who had finally begun to relax, her crest lowering, the protective tension in her massive frame easing slightly now that the immediate threat had been contained. "Commander Hart, I owe you an apology on behalf of this summit's organizers. This should never have been allowed to happen." I rested my hand against Cinder's side, feeling the last of her tension fade beneath my palm, her breathing slowing back toward its usual steady rhythm. "She protected us," I said simply, looking around at the gathered crowd of delegates who had witnessed the entire confrontation, their expressions ranging from shock to something I had not seen directed at humanity's delegation before this moment. Genuine, unguarded respect, not with violence, not with aggression. She simply stood where she needed to stand, and that was enough to stop whatever this was meant to accomplish. Tarn Oskev, who had followed the crowd into the corridor along with everyone else, stood near the back of the gathered delegates, his earlier confident skepticism replaced by an expression I could not fully read, though something in his posture suggested the demonstration he had requested only minutes earlier had just been provided, in a manner far more convincing than anything he could have orchestrated himself. Security officers began questioning the two detained figures, and within the hour, it would be confirmed that they belonged to a private contracting group with no official summit affiliation, hired by an unnamed party interested in acquiring, quote, biological specimens of unusual diplomatic significance. The investigation would take days to fully unravel who exactly had ordered the attempt, but the immediate consequence was already rippling through the station, faster than any official report could contain it. Humanity's pet, the creature so many delegations had dismissed as an elaborate diplomatic trick during the welcome banquet, had just calmly, without a single act of true aggression, prevented an armed seizure attempt in the middle of a neutral trade summit. Grace found me later that evening, back in our quarters, sitting beside Cinder, while she finally allowed herself to truly rest. Her massive body curled protectively close to where I sat, one golden eye cracking open every few minutes to check that I remained within reach. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Grace said quietly, settling onto the bench beside me. "Whatever plan you had for tonight, I'm guessing a kidnapping attempt wasn't part of it." "No," I admitted. "It wasn't." I looked down at Cinder, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the quiet trust in the way she had positioned herself between us and the door even in rest. But it confirmed something I think this entire station needed to understand, faster than I expected them to learn it. "What's that?" "That we're not playing games," I said. Whatever they thought we were doing, showing off, putting on a display to manipulate their perceptions, none of that matters anymore. They just watched something they consider an apex predator choose, on her own, to protect rather than attack, even when provoked, even when threatened. That's not a trick you can train into a creature that size. That's something deeper than training. I paused, watching Cinder's tail twitch gently in her sleep. And by tomorrow, every delegation on this station is going to be asking themselves the same question. If this is how humanity's companion behaves under genuine threat, what does that actually tell them about us? Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying Cinder's sleeping form with an expression that had shifted, somewhere over the past 2 days, from cautious tolerance into something closer to genuine affection. "Kessin's going to be back tomorrow," she said finally, "and he won't be the only one. After tonight, I don't think anyone on this station is going to settle for whispers anymore. They're going to want the real story." I nodded slowly, watching the lights of the station glimmer faintly through the narrow viewport across the room, distant stars scattered between the running lights of docked transport vessels. Somewhere beyond those stars lay the war zone where Cinder's story had truly begun, a story I had carried carefully, deliberately, since long before this summit had started, waiting for exactly the right moment to finally let it be heard. That moment, I realized, had just arrived far sooner than I had planned for. Tomorrow, I would have to decide exactly how much of the truth this galaxy was ready to hear. They came the next morning, exactly as Grace had predicted, though the size of the group surprised even me. Lyra Voss arrived first, accompanied by 2 senior Cetran officials I had not yet met, followed shortly by Trade Director Kessin and a younger Voth assistant carrying a recording device clearly meant to document whatever was about to be said. Tarn Oskev arrived last, standing slightly apart from the others near the doorway of our quarters, his expression unreadable, though he made no move to leave despite the obvious tension of a Krognar military officer standing in close proximity to a creature he had so recently tried to provoke into proving herself dangerous. I had been expecting this conversation since the moment I submitted the paperwork to bring Cinder onto this station, had rehearsed versions of it during the long transport flight from Earth, had turned the exact wording over in my mind so many times that the words felt worn smooth, like stones carried in a pocket. Even so, standing in the small common room of our quarters with 6 pairs of alien eyes fixed on me, all waiting for an explanation that I knew would change how every species present understood humanity, I felt my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the simple weight of the moment. Cinder lay quietly near the window, apparently unbothered by the crowded room, though I noticed she kept one eye open, tracking each visitor with the patient, unhurried attention of a creature who had long ago learned that most threats announced themselves before they became real ones. "Commander Hart," Lyra said, settling into the chair Grace offered her, the rest of the delegation arranging themselves around the small room, with varying degrees of comfort given the limited human-sized furniture. "After yesterday's events, the summit organizers feel it is necessary, and I believe appropriate, for you to share the full account of your companion's origin, not for our records alone, though they will be kept, but because I believe every delegation present at this summit deserves to understand exactly what humanity has brought among us." I glanced at Grace, who gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, the same quiet encouragement she had offered before every difficult negotiation we had faced together over the past several years. I took a slow breath and began. 6 years ago, when humanity first made contact with the wider galaxy, most of you know the broad outline of what happened. First contact protocols, Trade agreements. The slow process of being accepted into a community that had existed for far longer than we had even known the stars held other minds. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. What most of you do not know is that 2 years before that official first contact, a long-range human exploration vessel encountered something else entirely. Not a peaceful species reaching out to make contact, a war zone. The room had gone very still, the only sound the faint hum of the station's environmental systems and Cinder's slow, steady breathing. The vessel was called the Halvern, a deep-range survey ship sent to map uncharted systems on the edge of what we now understand to be contested territory, between several species who had been at conflict for longer than anyone aboard that ship could have known. They were not supposed to be there. They had drifted off their planned course due to a navigation malfunction, and by the time the crew realized their mistake, they had already dropped out of transit directly into the middle of an active conflict zone. Kessen's antennae had gone very still, his ancient eyes fixed on me with an intensity that suggested he already had some understanding of what I was describing, perhaps from old trade records or half-forgotten histories passed down through his own people. The crew of the Halvern did not understand who was fighting, or why, or which side, if either, represented anything resembling a cause worth supporting. What they understood was that a planet below them was burning, that the conflict had clearly been raging for a long time, and that neither side appeared particularly concerned about what their fighting was doing to the world itself, or the creatures that called it home. I felt my voice tighten slightly, even after all this time, even after telling pieces of this story before. The captain of the Halvern made a decision that violated nearly every protocol humanity had established for first contact with unknown conflicts. She ordered the ship to descend, despite the danger, to search for survivors among the wreckage on the surface, human or otherwise. This was incredibly reckless, Tarn said from the doorway, though his tone carried something other than judgment now, something closer to grudging interest. It was, I agreed. It was also, I think, the moment that defined what kind of species humanity was going to become to the rest of the galaxy. Long before any of you ever met us officially, the crew found very little on that surface. Burned forests. Collapsed structures that might once have been settlements, though belonging to which side of the conflict, nobody could say. And in the ruins of what appeared to be some kind of breeding facility, half collapsed and abandoned, they found a single intact egg, roughly the size of a small vehicle, still warm despite the destruction surrounding it. I looked toward Cinder, who had lifted her head slightly, as if some part of her understood, even now, that the story being told belonged to her. Nobody on that crew had any idea what kind of creature the egg belonged to. There was no record, no documentation, nothing salvageable from the facility that could explain what they had found. They could have left it. Every protocol, every reasonable argument for caution said they should have left it exactly where it was and returned to human space to report the contact and the danger they had narrowly avoided. I paused again, letting the silence stretch before continuing. They brought it aboard instead. Lyra's eyes had shifted through several colors during my account, settling now into a deep, contemplative blue that I had come to associate, over the past few days, with genuine thoughtfulness rather than simple diplomatic neutrality. "And the egg hatched aboard your vessel," she said quietly. 6 weeks later, I confirmed. Nobody aboard the Halvern had any experience raising a creature like Cinder. There were no manuals, no breeding programs, no generations of careful study to draw from. They simply did what humans have always done when faced with something helpless and unprecedented. They learned as they went, made mistakes, adjusted, and slowly figured out what she needed to survive and grow. I felt the corner of my mouth lift slightly, despite the weight of the story. She imprinted on the crew almost immediately after hatching, the way certain Earth species do, recognizing the first beings she encountered as something close to family, rather than predator or prey. By the time the Halvern returned to human space, 18 months later, Cinder was already larger than most of the crew, and utterly, completely devoted to the people who had raised her. "This creature," Kessen said slowly, his voice carrying a note of something close to wonder, "an apex predator from a species capable of producing eggs the size you describe, simply accepted your kind as her own family, with no genetic or instinctive basis for that bond." "She did," I said, "and she's not alone." The room shifted at that, every delegate present suddenly leaning forward slightly, sensing that the story had not yet reached its true point. The Halverns' discovery was not kept secret within human space, I continued. Once the crew returned and explained what had happened, what they had found and chosen to protect, it sparked something within humanity that I don't think any of us fully expected. Exploration vessels began carrying specialized equipment for exactly this kind of discovery, on the slim chance they encountered something similar during future deep-range surveys. Wildlife rescue specialists were embedded into long-range crews. Resources were allocated, quietly, without much public discussion, toward the possibility that humanity might encounter more orphaned creatures from conflicts we had no part in, and no understanding of. How many, Lyra asked carefully, have been found since the Halverns' discovery? I held her gaze for a long moment before answering. I'm not authorized to give an exact number, I said honestly. But I can tell you that Cinder is not the only creature like her currently living among human worlds. She is, as far as I know, the largest, and certainly the one I am personally bonded to most closely, but she represents a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Humanity has spent the past several years quietly becoming a species that other beings abandoned, orphaned, or displaced apex creatures recognize as a place of safety, simply because we have never once turned away from a helpless thing, because it happened to be inconvenient, frightening, or difficult to understand. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear the faint sound of station traffic outside our quarters, distant and muffled through the walls. Tarn Oskev finally broke it, stepping fully into the room for the first time since the conversation had begun, his armored frame somehow seeming less imposing than it had during our earlier confrontation in the negotiation chamber corridor. You understand, he said slowly, what this means for how every species in this room is going to view your people going forward. I have some idea, I said. We measure threat by strength, Tarn continued. By claws, by armor, by the size of a fleet, or the sharpness of a weapon. Your species arrived among the stars with none of that, and we dismissed you accordingly, assumed you posed little risk to anyone, assumed your soft skin and your lack of natural defenses meant you required protection rather than respect. He paused, glancing toward Cinder, who had settled back down but kept her golden eyes open, watching the conversation with the same patient attentiveness she had shown throughout. But strength is not only measured in what a species can destroy. It is also measured in what a species chooses to protect, even when protecting it offers no strategic advantage, even when doing so means accepting enormous risk for no certain reward. Kessin nodded slowly in agreement, his ancient eyes studying me with renewed consideration. A species willing to descend into an active conflict zone, to rescue a single egg, with no knowledge of what it might become, asks a very different question than the one we have all been asking since your arrival among the stars, he said. We have been asking how dangerous humanity might be. Perhaps the better question is how far humanity is willing to go for something it has decided is worth protecting. I felt something tighten in my chest at those words, a recognition of exactly the shift I had been hoping this summit would produce, though I had not expected it to arrive through quite so dramatic a sequence of events. We're not trying to threaten anyone, I said carefully. Cinder is not a weapon, and humanity is not interested in conquest. But I think it's fair to say that this galaxy has spent 6 years deciding what kind of species we are, based on assumptions that were never accurate to begin with. Maybe it's time those assumptions were updated. Lyra Voss rose slowly from her seat, her eyes settled now into a steady, deliberate shade of deep blue, the color her people associated with serious resolve, rather than casual conversation. I think, she said, that update has already begun, Commander Hart, whether this summit intended it to or not. She glanced toward the small recording device the Voth assistant had been operating throughout our entire conversation, capturing every word for whatever official record this revelation would eventually become. By tomorrow morning, every delegation on this station will know what you have told us today. And by next week, I suspect every system connected to the trade networks will know it as well. I looked down at Cinder, who met my gaze with the quiet, unwavering trust of a creature who had never once doubted, since the moment she hatched into a world of strangers, who chose to keep her anyway, that she belonged exactly where she was. Whatever happened next, whatever ripple effects this revelation sent through the wider galaxy, I knew one thing with complete certainty. The story was no longer mine to control. It belonged to the galaxy now, and the galaxy was about to spend a very long time deciding what to do with it. News moves strangely across a galaxy built from 100 different communication systems, faster in some places than others, distorted and reshaped as it travels through translators and relay stations, and the particular biases of whoever happens to be repeating it. By the time I woke the following morning, the story of the Halvern, of Cinder, of humanity's quiet habit of rescuing orphaned apex creatures from conflicts we had no part in, had already spread far beyond the boundaries of Verlanus Station, carried outward through the trade networks at a speed that even Lyra Voss, with all her diplomatic experience, seemed faintly startled by. Grace found me in the common room of our quarters, scrolling through a tablet displaying summaries from at least a dozen different news feeds, each one presenting the story with its own particular spin. Some treated it as a fascinating curiosity, a strange and admirable quirk of a young species still finding its place among the stars. Others treated it with open suspicion, theorizing that humanity must have some hidden strategic purpose behind a program that, on its surface, offered no obvious military or economic advantage. A few, the ones that worried me most, framed it as a warning, a reminder to every species in the galaxy that the small, soft, seemingly harmless newcomers might be capable of far more than anyone had previously assumed. "It's everywhere," Grace said, setting the tablet down on the table between us. "Every major trade hub between here and the Kragnar home systems has picked up some version of the story. Kessen's delegation has already requested an official meeting to discuss expanding trade relations with Earth, specifically around what they're calling, and I'm quoting directly here, wildlife conservation partnerships. They want access," I said, not entirely surprised, "either to study how we do it, or to position themselves favorably with a species that just demonstrated it might be more capable than anyone gave us credit for." "Probably both," Grace agreed. "But it's not just trade interest. Security Council representatives from at least 3 different systems have requested formal briefings on what they're calling, and again I'm quoting, the strategic implications of bonded Apex companion programs." She paused, a faint, tired smile crossing her face. "Daniel, I think you just changed how an entire region of the galaxy thinks about humanity, in the span of about 3 days. I felt the weight of that settle over me slowly, the realization that what had begun as a calculated diplomatic strategy, a way to make a small, underestimated delegation impossible to dismiss, had grown into something far larger and more consequential than I had originally intended. I had wanted respect for our delegation, a fair seat at the negotiating table during this single trade summit. What I had apparently triggered was a galaxy-wide recalculation of what humanity actually represented among the stars. Cinder, oblivious to the magnitude of what her existence had set in motion, stretched lazily near the window, the morning light from the station's artificial sun catching along her scaled hide in shifting patterns of deep blue and charcoal. She yawned, displaying rows of teeth that had, only 2 days earlier, sent an entire corridor of seasoned diplomats scattering in alarm, and then settled back down with the unbothered contentment of a creature who understood only that her human was nearby. The room was warm, and nothing in her immediate surroundings required further attention. The summons came just after midday, delivered by a junior Cetran aide who informed me, with evident nervousness, that Lyra Voss requested my presence at an emergency session of the summit's full assembly, a gathering of every delegation present on the station, rather than the usual smaller negotiating groups. Such full assemblies, I had learned during my briefings before departure, were rare, typically reserved for matters that affected the entire trade network rather than individual bilateral agreements. I brought Cinder with me, more out of habit than calculated strategy at this point, though I noticed the corridors we passed through on the way to the main assembly chamber had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways since the banquet just a few days earlier. Delegates who had once flattened against walls or scattered at our approach now offered careful, measured nods of acknowledgement, the particular respect reserved for beings whose capabilities had been demonstrated rather than merely claimed. A young Voth trader, perhaps the same one who had startled during our first walk through the concourse, actually paused to dip her antennae in what I had come to recognize as a gesture of formal respect, before continuing on her way. The assembly chamber dwarfed even the banquet hall in scale, a vast circular space, with tiered seating, rising in concentric rings around a central podium, designed to accommodate every delegation currently present at the summit simultaneously. As I entered with Grace at my side and Cinder following at her usual unhurried pace, I felt hundreds of eyes, compound and slitted and forward-facing, turned toward us in a wave that rippled outward from the entrance to the farthest reaches of the chamber. Lyra Voss stood at the central podium, flanked by senior representatives from several major delegations, including Kessin and, somewhat to my surprise, Tarn Oskev, who had apparently been elevated from simple military attaché to an active participant in whatever discussion was about to unfold. She gestured for me to approach, and I made my way down through the chamber, Cinder's presence parting the gathered crowd more effectively than any formal escort could have managed. Delegates of the Verlanis Trade Summit, Lyra began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. 3 days ago, the delegation of Earth arrived among us, carrying assumptions that every species present, myself included, had built around a fundamental misunderstanding of what this newly contacted civilization actually represents. She paused, allowing the weight of that admission to settle across the gathered crowd. We measured humanity by size, by physical strength, by the absence of natural weapons or armored defenses, and we concluded, prematurely and incorrectly, that they posed little of consequence to the established order of this galaxy. A murmur passed through the chamber, the particular sound of hundreds of beings simultaneously recalling their own private assumptions and finding them suddenly, uncomfortably exposed. What we have since learned, Lyra continued, is that humanity measures its own strength by an entirely different standard, not by what they are capable of destroying, but by what they are willing to protect, even at significant risk, even when no immediate advantage justifies the effort. Her eyes found mine across the distance of the podium, and I saw something there that had not been present during our first conversation just days earlier. A genuine, considered respect that no amount of diplomatic posturing could have manufactured. Commander Hart, I would ask that you share with this full assembly what you have already shared with a smaller gathering, so that every delegation present understands clearly what kind of neighbor has joined our community among the stars. I stepped up to the podium, Cinder settling at the base of the small platform, with the patient stillness she had shown throughout every formal gathering since our arrival, and I looked out across the vast chamber, hundreds of beings from dozens of species, all waiting to hear, in my own words, the story that had already spread across half the galaxy in fragmented, distorted pieces. I told them everything, the Halvern, the burning world, the captain's decision to descend despite every reasonable argument for caution, the egg, warm and intact amid destruction that had claimed everything else, the 18 months of learning, mistake by mistake, how to raise something humanity had never encountered before, with no manual, no precedent, nothing but stubborn determination, and the simple refusal to abandon something helpless. I told them about the quiet expansion of humanity's deep-range survey programs, the wildlife specialists embedded into exploration crews, the resources allocated without fanfare toward the possibility of finding more orphaned creatures from conflicts that were never ours to begin with. When I finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that follows a truth too large to immediately absorb. It was Kessin who finally broke it, rising slowly from his seat among the gathered delegates, his ancient voice carrying clearly across the chamber despite its quiet, measured tone. I have spent 11 decades trading across this galaxy, he said. I have negotiated with species who measure their worth in conquered territory, in the size of their fleets, in the fear they can inspire among their neighbors. I have never, in all that time, encountered a species that chose to measure its worth by the helpless things it refused to leave behind. He paused, his multiple eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. I do not believe this is a species we should fear, delegates. I believe it is a species we should be grateful arrived among the stars at all. Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the chamber, though I could see, in the careful stillness of certain delegations, that not every species present shared Kessin's sentiment. Caution, I understood, was not the same as fear, and a galaxy that had just learned humanity's gentleness, extended toward orphaned monsters, would also, inevitably, begin to wonder what humanity might be capable of if that same fierce protectiveness were ever turned toward defense rather than rescue. Tarn Oskev stepped forward next, his armored frame somehow carrying less of the aggressive posturing I had encountered during our first confrontation in the negotiation chamber corridor. I challenged this delegation, he said, addressing the assembly directly, because I believed their display was manufactured, a trick designed to manipulate this summit's perceptions through intimidation rather than genuine capability. I was wrong. He glanced towards Cinder, who lifted her head slightly at the attention, studying him with the same patient golden gaze she had shown during their first encounter. What I witnessed 2 days ago was not a trained performance. It was a creature choosing, of her own will, to protect rather than destroy, even when threatened directly. That is not something any military program in known space has ever successfully replicated, and I do not believe it can be manufactured through training alone. It requires something deeper, trust perhaps, or love, if such a word applies between species as different as yours and hers. I felt something tighten in my chest at his words, an unexpected weight of validation from a being who, only days earlier, had been actively trying to provoke Cinder into proving herself dangerous. Lyra Voss returned to the podium as the murmurs settled. Her eyes shifted now into a deep, resolved shade of blue. This summit was convened to negotiate trade agreements, she said. I believe what has actually happened here is something far more significant. We have learned, in the span of a few short days, that the smallest delegation among us may carry the largest capacity for both gentleness and quiet strength that this galaxy has encountered in generations. I propose, with the full Assembly's consideration, that future trade negotiations with Earth proceed not from a position of cautious tolerance, but from genuine respect, earned through demonstration, rather than simply granted through diplomatic courtesy. The vote that followed, conducted through the Chamber's formal Assembly protocols, passed with a margin wide enough that even Lyra seemed faintly surprised by its decisiveness. Trade terms that had stalled for 2 days under the assumption that humanity's delegation held little genuine leverage suddenly found themselves renegotiated within hours. Favorable agreements reached not through pressure or threat, but through the simple, undeniable fact that every delegation in that chamber now understood exactly what kind of species they were dealing with. That evening, as the summit's formal proceedings finally concluded, and delegations began the slow process of departing Verlanus Station for their respective home systems, I stood with Grace, near the observation deck overlooking the docking bays, watching transport ships undock one by one and drift away into the surrounding starfield. Cinder rested beside us, her massive head turned toward the viewport, watching the distant lights with the same patient curiosity she brought to everything in her unhurried, contented existence. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" Grace said quietly, watching a Kragnar transport vessel pull away from its docking clamp and accelerate toward the open stars. Word's going to keep spreading. Every system connected to these trade networks is going to know about Cinder, about the Halvern, about every other creature humanity has quietly taken in since then. They're going to start asking questions we haven't even prepared answers for yet. "I know," I said, resting my hand against Cinder's scaled side, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing beneath my palm. "But I think that's exactly what needed to happen. This galaxy spent 6 years deciding humanity was small and harmless because that's what we looked like from the outside. They never once stopped to ask what we were actually capable of, because they never imagined the answer might have nothing to do with strength as they understood it." Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars beyond the viewport, scattered points of light, marking systems and species and stories we had not yet encountered, conflicts we had not yet discovered, creatures still waiting somewhere out there, for someone willing to descend into danger and choose to protect rather than walk away. "What happens now?" she asked finally. I thought about the question for a long moment, watching Cinder's golden eyes drift slowly shut, her enormous body settling into peaceful rest beside us, despite the momentous events of the past several days, utterly unconcerned with the galaxy-wide reassessment her existence had triggered, content simply to be near the people she had chosen as her own. "Now," I said quietly, "the rest of the galaxy gets to spend some time wondering exactly how many more of us there are out there, quietly raising things they were taught to fear, and calling them family instead." I looked out at the scattered stars, the distant systems still unaware of what humanity had been doing, patiently and without fanfare, in the years since first contact. I think that's a question worth letting them sit with for a while. Beside us, Cinder exhaled a long, contented breath, her tail curling gently around my legs in her sleep, anchoring me to the deck, plating the same way she had anchored humanity's reputation among the stars, in just a handful of days. Somewhere beyond the station, the story was already traveling onward, system to system, delegation to delegation, carrying with it a single, quiet truth that the galaxy would spend a very long time learning to fully understand. Humanity had never measured strength by what it could destroy. It measured strength by what it refused to leave behind. And the galaxy, for the first time since we had arrived among the stars, was finally beginning to understand exactly what that meant.